Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Stratton. I'm the co-chair of the RHSC Advocacy and Accountability Working Group, and I apologize for the little bit of technical difficulties we had, but now we're ready to go. So I'm joined by Ellen Thompson of the System Strengthening Working Group, as well as two presenters today, Dorothy Thomas of VillageReach and Mike Krautman from the William Davidson Institute. I'm going to do a little introduction and then we'll have the presentation, and Ellen will help with the moderating of questions at the end. So we're really excited today to present what VillageReach and William Davidson Institute have developed, which is a light touch modeling tool to improve RH supply chain efficiency. Improving supply chain performance has been an important recent focus area for RHSC, as you may know. And over the past year, we've funded VillageReach and William Davidson Institute, also known as WDI, through the Innovation Fund to develop a tool that helps RH program leaders more easily estimate supply chain costs and explore different ways of improving supply chain efficiency. So we're going to learn a little bit more about how this works and explore some use cases that it can help address. For the moment, everyone is muted, and you can type your questions in the chat box and we'll moderate those when we get to that time in the webinar. And if you have questions, if you're having trouble, you can raise your virtual hand. You should see a little hand icon. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Dorothy and Mike to get us started.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone, and thanks everyone for your attention and your participation today. My name is Dorothy Thomas, and I'm an associate in the supply chain group at VillageReach, which is a Seattle-based nonprofit that's committed to saving lives through improved availability of quality healthcare and healthcare commodities. Today, my colleague Mike and I are going to be providing an update of a project between VillageReach and WDI, and so I'll let Mike go ahead and introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Krautman. I'm a research manager at the William Davidson Institute. And for those who don't know, we're part of the business school at the University of Michigan, focused on using business tools to improve quality, accessibility, and sustainability of healthcare in low and middle income countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So as you all might be able to glean from the title, this presentation is going to focus on how we can improve reproductive health supply chain design by using a rapid and flexible cost modeling tool. Mike, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So today, Mike and I are going to be sharing our work on this System Strengthening Working Group sponsored Innovation Fund project to develop a rapid and flexible supply chain cost modeling tool. We're going to start by providing an overview of the project, specifically focusing on what questions the tool can help us address. And then we'll discuss in greater detail the specifications that support the tool in being quicker and easier to use. We'll also share some insights from our validation exercise to test the accuracy of the tool. From there, Mike will walk us through a live demonstration to give us a better sense of how to operate and interpret model outputs. And then we'll use the last of our time together to respond to any questions that you might have. Cool. So let's hop to it. To ease us into our discussion about the tool, we'd like to talk about what first inspired us to develop a rapid and flexible costing tool in the first place. And while we very much understand that supply chains are crucial to the success of health programs, we also know that identifying efficient supply chain designs can actually be quite a complex and expensive process. And I don't think that we really have to convince too many folks on this call today of the importance of effective supply chains. But when you get right down to it, the first step in improving access to and consumption of reproductive health commodities is ensuring that those products are reliably available when and where they're most needed. Efficiency also plays an important role here. Supply chains can be costly to operate, so the more efficiently you're able to actually to deliver products, the more money you have for direct client-focused activities. So something that's come up time and time again in our work is that it can actually be quite challenging to enact meaningful change and improve efficiency at the strategic and structural level. So even gathering basic data on supply chain costs can be quite resource intensive and time consuming. So to get an accurate picture, you typically have to go out and collect that data in person at the local level. And once you do have that costing data, there's still a lot you don't know. Like, are your costs high or are they low? Are we doing very well, or is there actually a ton of room for improvement when it comes to supply chain costs and efficiency? So traditional costing evaluations can tell you how much your existing system costs, but there are challenges around estimating the impact of potential changes you might be interested in making to the supply chain design. So for example, what are the cost implications of delivering to more locations, or maybe implementing some new approach for managing last mile deliveries, such as an informed push model? I want to point out that it is possible to explore some different supply chain designs using existing mechanisms, but doing so typically requires some kind of software such as LlamaSoft or Hermes, which can be expensive services to use and requires very specialized skills. Go to the next slide. So this is an illustrative point indicating how resource intensive it can be to really dig into the types of supply chain design questions that we're talking about. In 2017, UNICEF estimated that it would require 3 to 6 months, as well as a budget between 250,000 and 500,000 US dollars for a country to analyze different supply chain redesign options, with data collection and modeling actually being the primary cost drivers to that estimate. And so we think this is a really tangible example that indicates how resource intensive and prohibitive it can be to enter into this process. So over at VillageReach and WDI, we believe that there's an opportunity here to really address these challenges and barriers to entry by creating tools that can be used to conduct a quick and higher level supply chain cost analysis. So this Excel-based tool that we've developed allows us to estimate the rough costs of a supply chain, as well as the cost implications of different design options without depending on costly, highly specialized software. It's also capable of operating with a lower data burden than traditional costing approaches. So through our Innovation Fund grant over the past year, WDI and VillageReach have really been working to develop a tool to fill this gap. So some of the use cases where a rapid and flexible supply chain design tool could be leveraged include some of the following. So streamlining or facilitating some of the initial ideating around supply chain design analyses, weighing different design options to demonstrate cost implications of different supply chain reconfigurations. So this is something that could be done in real time, for example, in a workshop setting. Validating donor budgets or bids for outsourcing key supply chain logistics activities, and then also advocating for supply chain funding or improvements. This tool can help us understand if we're requesting an adequate amount of funding for supply chain, and it can also understand if we should be prioritizing supply chain reform. So by reducing the barrier to entry for executing these analyses, this tool can help us expand our opportunities for actualizing innovative design options. So what does the tool tell us? Here we have some of the key outputs that the model provides, and Mike is going to shortly lead us through more of the technical details about model inputs and outputs. But from a high-level perspective, the user creates supply chain scenarios by defining things such as how large the country is, how many facilities are served in the system, and how many tiers or levels of the supply chain there are, by defining unit costs for things such as fuel and an hour of labor salaries. How do products move through the system? So do facilities travel upstream to collect products from a supplier? Or does the supplier deliver directly to the facilities? The model uses information of that nature to build a high-level view of the supply chain, and subsequently providing outputs that help us answer questions like, what's the annual operating cost of the supply chain? the volume delivered to health facilities, the value of commodities procured. You can see this in box number 1. It also gives us a sense in box number 2 of where does most of that funding go from the perspective of is it the central and regional level warehouses, or perhaps it's health facilities? What level, what tiers of the supply chain are responsible for more or less cost? It also gives us a sense of cost breakdowns for different supply chain functions such as storage, transportation, or management. And then the outputs also provide, as you can see in the 4th box, insights into the extent to which supply chain resources are being used efficiently. This is helpful for responding to questions such as how much warehousing space and vehicles do we actually have to make the supply chain work? How much do we actually need? And do we currently have too much or too little of these resources? So one of the tool's functionalities that's pretty practical and I think pretty neat is that it's configured to easily create and compare different design scenarios. So what this means is that once you've input data one time, then you can pretty much just copy and paste worksheets to create different scenarios by changing some of the inputs. So the model actually updates in real time. It actually updates the results in real time from all scenarios. And so then you can compare results from all scenarios in a side-by-side comparison on the main dashboard. So on this page, you can see the different scenarios that are being explored and compared, which include delivering more frequently, maybe to improve quality of service, removing layers or tiers from the system in an effort maybe to improve efficiency, and then also changing the way that ordering and delivery of products is managed, in this case, in an informed push type model. And I think it's worth noting here that many of the changes that one would make to modify the scenarios that we have listed here are actually quite straightforward and require only a few changes, quick tweaks that can be updated really in a matter of minutes. So we believe that a tool like this and the types of analyses it can support are quite useful for reproductive health advocates. On the funding side, it helps us think about and respond to questions like how much funding do we need for supply chain? What are the greatest cost drivers and where are they located? Based on current funding levels, do we see any major gaps or mismatches? And then from a design perspective, a tool like this helps us answer questions like how much of a priority should supply chain design actually be? How much funding, relatively speaking, could be freed up if we had a more efficient system in place? What types of changes have the greatest impact on cost? Is it eliminating a tier, maybe changing roles and responsibilities? And then we anticipate that many of these advocacy-focused use cases will likely fall into the gap that our tool is designed to address, where you maybe don't need an incredibly detailed or precise answer, but where a high-level estimate is sufficient, and maybe where you don't have the time or budget to do a full-scale analysis. So anyway, I'm going to pass it over to Mike now to discuss a bit more of the details around the technical details of the model.
All right, thanks, Dorothy. So I want to spend the next few slides expanding on one aspect of the tool that we think really differentiates it from a lot of the other supply chain modeling tools that are out there, and that is, again, the focus on flexibility and speed in use. And again, we really believe that these characteristics are important to, help expand access to small scale or early stage supply chain analyses. And there are really 3 overarching ways in which we try to improve speed and flexibility of the tool. And the first is by compiling and incorporating proxy data or reference and benchmark data, or even other supporting calculator worksheets to help users quickly estimate values to fill in gaps in their own data sets. And the second way is by consolidating and standardizing the types of supply chain design choices that you can make, which ultimately allows you, like Dorothy mentioned, to easily switch back and forth between different types of supply chain design. And then the third way is to ultimately simplify the way that we represent the overall supply chain structure, which minimizes the data and the calculations that we need to collect, and perform, and ultimately allows us to fit this tool onto an Excel-based platform. And so, like I mentioned, proxy data are one of the main ways that we try to help improve speed. And this is basically just leveraging data that already exists in the global health world. So, for things like the cost of warehousing space, or the price of vehicles, or overall system demand volumes for different types of health programs, the global health community already has this type of information floating around. It's been collected in all sorts of different costing studies across numerous different countries and different types of supply chains. And if this data were available and you were willing to live with or extrapolate from a similar country's data or results, then you could actually save yourself a lot of time by not having to go collect this data from scratch. And again, there's a time and place to go collect data from scratch, but there are also times when speed and flexibility take precedence, and that's really the use case that we're focused on here. And so with the tool, what we do is take these detailed costing study results from around the global health world, and we format them into data templates that match our tool's input structure. So it's basically like a questionnaire with all the questions already filled in, all the answers already filled in. And so that way, if you want to use those data points directly in your model, in your analysis, all it takes is just a few clicks of a mouse on your computer, and you're able to sort of load up that data set. Or you can just use that data more generally as a benchmark or a reference for estimating your own value. So say, for example, you want to know the price of a Land Cruiser. You might go look through the data templates, and you could find 5 or 6 different point estimates for that value, and that gives you an idea of what the range of different values are, so that you can find some place kind of within that range to place your own estimate. And so it's also not an all or nothing thing. At any point you can override the proxy data with a value that you input yourself if you feel like you can improve on that estimate. And so in either case, our goal is really to make it easy to quickly estimate those values for data inputs that you don't currently have available. And so we've gotten a start compiling these data templates, and we have several on hand that have been incorporated into the model. But our ultimate vision here is really to kind of compile a large and diverse different set of these data templates, with the idea that eventually most users would be able to find at least one data template that's pretty close to their own country and supply chain context. And then a second approach we've taken is to build in a series of design choices, or you call them decision-making levers, that describe and capture most common global health supply chain or distribution strategies. And so I guess looking across the landscape of different global health supply chains, we have lots of different names for all of our supply chains. We've got mobile warehouse, we've got informed push model, we've got assisted pull model, direct delivery, et cetera, et cetera. We also have more acronyms than I can count: DDIC, IC, DD, et cetera. But when you actually look at those those models in terms of their actual flow of products and information, you can break them down into a relatively small number of design decisions, which are shown here on the slide. And those are things like, which levels are you storing inventory at, and how frequently are you replenishing inventory, and what kind of travel patterns are you using to travel between different levels of the supply chain, which is that sort of expanded diagram there on the right. Are you traveling out and back to each facility individually, or are you visiting multiple facilities along a preset route? So anyways, you can break those designs down into this relatively small number of decision-making levers. And in the tool, we've incorporated all these levers explicitly, along with some basic logic, I guess you could say, for how the model responds to changes to each of those levers. And so as a result, again, with relatively few changes in the model, you can switch between different distribution strategies. Say, one where facility staff travel up, to a supplier to collect product and then travel back to their health facility, to one such as an informed push or a mobile warehouse style model where, a regional manager or a district manager is actually managing the ordering and the delivery process for the facilities. And so then, as Dorothy mentioned, as you make these changes in the model, then the outputs update in real time. And then finally, we make a number of modeling assumptions that simplify how supply chains are represented in the tool. So, for example, we assume that within any single tier, that every facility is equivalent. And so that means that each health clinic has the same average level of demand and is the same sort of average distance away from its upstream supplier. And the same would be true if you're talking about each district office or each regional warehouse or whatever other tiers you're using. And so it's obviously this is less complex than a real world supply chain network, but it also enables us then to populate a model based on what a typical facility looks like, or a typical warehouse, which tends to be an easier thing for people to visualize and to estimate, which again fits in with this theme of making the tool rapid and easier to use. Additionally, the model costs out each supply chain design as it should operate, but not necessarily how it does in real life. So, for example, if you're supposed to travel between point A and point B, the model assumes that you travel between point A and point B. And if instead you stop somewhere along the way, or if you had to make a second trip because the order got mixed up, then your true costs are going to differ from the model estimates. And obviously this assumption is true of many other modeling tools and also many costing studies as well. But we just wanted to highlight that it's also true with our tool. And then finally, the tool models essentially a steady state long-term operating costs and not the costs of actually switching or implementing a supply chain design. So that would be things like developing new training protocols or developing new materials or SOPs. That while we would like to model that, it depends so much on the political dynamics and the capacity for change and things that are ultimately out of scope of this tool. And so the assumptions that we make here do come with trade-offs. They essentially create kind of a best case scenario for supply chain costs, which could be biased in situations where you have a really unique geography, or if demand is really highly concentrated in a few areas, or if the supply chain design is being implemented in less than ideal conditions. But on the other hand, it greatly reduces the amount of data and the complexity of the calculations that we need, which ultimately makes it feasible to try to shoehorn this tool into an Excel platform. And then I guess one more final point too, that the bias or the error that we see in this model is also likely to be consistent across different scenarios that you analyze. So in a study where you are comparing multiple different scenarios against each other, the impact of that error is somewhat minimized in that situation because it's the same across all the different models, or it's similar, I guess you'd say. And so in the end, I guess we believe these trade-offs are likely to be worthwhile for the use cases that we're targeting, where a quick, high-level estimate is better than not having any estimate at all, ultimately. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Dorothy to talk more about validating the model and the results.
Thanks, Mike. Let's move on to talking about what we've done so far to validate the tool's accuracy. So as we've discussed, we've done quite a bit of work to build the model and to make sure that it's equipped with features that help lower the barrier to entry when it comes to exploring supply chain costs in different scenarios. But our work doesn't really end there. We also wanted to test the model's accuracy. And to do this, we conducted a validation exercise. The main objective of this exercise was to get a better understanding of model accuracy so that we can make any changes that we needed to in order to help us have greater confidence in the model's reliability. The key questions we set out to answer in this exercise were the following: how accurate can the model results be under ideal conditions, and how does that accuracy level change when supply chain, when the data quality deteriorates? So how did we go about conducting this validation exercise? we had results from existing supply chain costing studies, which we used as the gold standard against which to validate the model's predictions. So our gold standards for this validation exercise were comprised of data from an integrated supply chain in a South African country, Senegal IPM data, as well as Forlac data from both Bolivia and Guatemala. And we used inputs provided from the raw data as well as publicly available information such as square kilometers of the target area, price of fuel, road quality between 2 points to build out the model inputs. And then we measured the difference, or the mean absolute percent error, between the model outputs to those from our gold standards, which, as a reminder, is the data from the existing supply chain costing studies. You can go to the next slide. So how accurate was the tool at replicating cost results when using similar data? So we had anticipated some margin of error, since this model does, as Mike was talking about in our assumptions section, it does take averages across individual facility data points, whereas the costing studies we referenced are much more sensitive to differences between facilities. However, we found that the model was pretty accurate across several studies and geographies. So on the left-hand side, I think it's your left-hand side with the bars, we can see that across the board, the mean absolute percent error was less than 20% when looking by line item, less than 10% when looking at overall cost categories, and then less than 5% when we look at the overall mean absolute percent error. So you'll remember that the other question we sought to answer was how well is accuracy maintained as data quality deteriorates. So the smaller red circles represent the best case scenario for data quality. This is where we compare costs only when we're confident in the data. And the larger blue circles is the rapid scenario. This is when we compare all cost lines using data that may not necessarily align with our gold standard data. When we look by line item, we see that there was a 22% error when we included misaligned or questionable quality data, which is over 3 times higher than the 6% error from the best case scenario. And then when looking by supply chain tier or category, there is a 14% mean absolute percent error when including misaligned data, and only about a 4% error based from the best case scenario. And then finally, when we look at the overall error, it was about 13% when including misaligned data, but less than 1% in the best case scenario. So I think this demonstrates that model accuracy is still very much dependent on having decent quality input data, but that the model does tolerate some data misalignment, particularly if we focus our attention on the overall error. Thank you. So the main takeaways from our validation exercise is that the level of error we observed is more or less in alignment with our initial expectations, which is to say that model accuracy is stronger in instances where higher quality data is being used. In such instances, we observed a 1 to 6% overall mean absolute percent error. And on the other hand, model accuracy deteriorates in instances where data quality is a bit sketchier or less reliable. So in these instances, we observed near between 12 and 22%. Something that to keep in mind is that many data errors are consistent across scenarios, which overall has a limited impact when it comes to getting those directional insights in the model. This is something Mike touched on a few moments ago as well. And then finally, we acknowledge that our work here isn't done. We would like to continue inputting proxy data into the model and using additional data sets to help us conduct further model validation, because this would help us to develop a stronger understanding of model accuracy and would also give us perspective or a sense of instances in which the model may be more or maybe less accurate. Maybe in examples when we're looking at different types of countries or different types of supply chain designs or potentially specific cost line items. So you can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So I'm now going to hand it over to Mike, who's going to lead us through a demonstration of the tool.
All right, thanks, Dorothy. So in this last section of the webinar, I'd like to do a couple of things. One, walk through the actual tool itself so that you get a sense of what the tool looks like, how it works and how it's actually used. And so while I'll spend a little time, just kind of walking through that tool, like I said, I thought that the best way to do a demonstration might actually be to use the tool to conduct, an example analysis. And so for that, we've created an actual problem statement, with a few specific supply chain design scenarios that we'd like to analyze. And the example is sort of made up for simplicity's sake, but it is based on issues and conversations that we've, both our organizations have had in the course of our work. And so the problem is this, as a program leader, you're expecting an increase in health product demand over the next several years, driven by things like, shifting or increasing populations and a rollout of a new social health insurance program. So let's say you think the demand could increase by as much as 50% over that time frame. So the question is, can the current supply chain handle this increase in demand? And if not, what are the best ways to actually adapt the supply chain to this new level of demand? And so, just thinking through a couple, the simplest ways of dealing with this challenge might be, number one, to, replenish, resupply health facilities more frequently, which then, it places an increased burden on your transportation, but it also lets you keep kind of the same, hopefully, the same storage and warehousing infrastructure. Or vice versa, maybe you want to increase your warehousing capacity while you're trying to keep the same, transportation system intact. And so that basically leads us to 4 potential scenarios to analyze. The first baseline scenario there is just, the current state supply chain with the current demand levels just to have on hand, as a true baseline. And then scenarios 2, 3, and 4 all have demand increase to 1.5 times their baseline level. And scenario 2 then keeps the same overall supply chain structure as the current system, just to see how it holds up to the new demand level. And scenario 3 then we switch from quarterly ordering system to a monthly resupply and ordering cycle. And then for scenario 4, we keep the same quarterly resupply cycle, but we then increase the storage capacity and the warehousing capacity by a factor of 1.5 to basically keep pace with demand growth. And so I'll move into the tool now, but I guess maybe just keep these 4 scenarios in mind, because these are the 4 that we will actually build out in the course of our analysis here in the tool. So let me go ahead and switch into a blank version of the tool. This is kind of the first landing page. So this is what you see when you open up the tool. And one of the first places to stop might be the table of contents there. And in the table of contents, you'll get a description of all the different worksheets that are in the tool, and you can see that they're split out into 4 main sets. The first set is the user guide. That's the purple worksheets down here at the bottom. And these summarize in much more detail than we can get into here, how to use the tool, what each of the input and output values mean, and so on. The second set are the actual main tool worksheets themselves. They're the worksheets in the blue here. And there are 3 types of those worksheets. The first is the scenario manager, which is sort of the one overarching dashboard that lets you create and organize and compare multiple scenarios. And then for each scenario, you have a set of input and output worksheets. Basically one set for each of the scenarios that you're modeling. And then the third set of worksheets are the supporting worksheets. And in general, these sheets are like, calculators or sets of reference data that help users estimate inputs that they don't necessarily have on hand. So things like demand volume or storage capacity, or the purchase price of different assets like vehicles and cold chain equipment. So for example, there's one reproductive health specific sheet there that estimates contraceptive demand, volume, and value for a given population by looking at, or by pulling from country-specific demographic data from DHS surveys and combining that with general unit price and volume data from UNFPA databases. So that's just one example. And then finally, the last set are these proxy data templates that I mentioned earlier, which again can be that they are sets of existing cost study data that's formatted to match our inputs worksheet. And so they can be quickly loaded there. We have several completed ones of those, and then we also have a blank one in the event that you have a full data set that you'd actually like to go ahead and add to the collection. So with that overview out of the way, then I guess let's go ahead and use the tool to create our first scenario. So for that, we'll start here in the scenario manager, and we'll select the number of scenarios we want to create. We'll create one for starters here, and then we will go ahead and give that a name. We'll call it baseline, and then now we input the names of the inputs and outputs worksheets that we're going to use. So we have two worksheets down here. We have one inputs and one outputs. So we'll go ahead and type those names into the cells. Like you can see there. And so now we're done with that table. We can scroll over to the right. This table we can largely ignore for now. And then the only other thing we need to make sure we have on here is if we're planning to use any data templates, we need to make sure to have the worksheet name of that template listed here on this list. And so for this one, we'll use a template that's called Southern Africa Province 1. We have the actual, if you go to the worksheet in the back of the tool, you can see some demographic information about that particular data set, how big the region was, what's the total population, and various other data points that let you kind of gauge how similar it is to your own country. But for now, anyways, we'll go ahead and use that, so we'll list it there. And now we'll move from the scenario manager, this is everything we need to input. Now we'll move into the actual inputs worksheet itself. Now the inputs worksheet is split up into 6 numbered sections. The first 4 set parameters for the overall supply chain. So these are things like, how much demand volume is there in the system, what are different salary levels for different types of personnel, and then, what do different types of vehicles cost and what is their fuel efficiency, that type of thing. So you'll use that throughout the rest of the model. Sections 5 and 6, get into information that's specific to individual tiers. So information about the national level or about the provincial level or the facility level. And so that would include things like how many facilities there are in each tier, information about storage of commodities at that tier. And then in section 6, information about how commodities or products get transported into that tier. So I'll ask a series of questions about that. What kind of vehicle, how are they traveling, who's traveling on those vehicles, etc. And so then one thing to point out here then is that each of these questions has a comment box, if you mouse over it, that gives a description of what the question means and what potentially some common input values might be for it. And so again, this is a view of a totally blank inputs worksheet, and you'll see that there's a lot of red there, which means there's a lot of data that needs to be input. And you can input that data directly. So if you keep on typing, you can see that as I enter the data in, let's say fuel's $1.50 a liter there. As I enter data in, it's in the green boxes, it's getting added to the set of data that's used in the model here in the adjacent white box. So you can enter all this data in by hand, or if you want to be more efficient, you can select a proxy data template that you want to go ahead and pre-populate all of those data cells. So you see I just selected that Southern Africa Province 1, and now all of these cells in the first 4 sections are sort of pre-populated with data from that study. Now that first selection just covers the first 4 sections. If I also have to select again for sections 5 and 6, so I'll select it again here, and then, there we go. So then in this section, not only do you have to specify the data template, you have to also specify which tier of that template you want to use. So in this example, we'll just stay faithful to the template, and we'll use their tier 3 data for our tier 3, we'll use their tier 2 data for our tier 2, and we'll use their tier 1 data for our tier 1. And so with those selections now, I've essentially filled out a baseline version of this worksheet. So we have all the inputs now that we need. Now you can override any of these inputs if you want to. So I can still change fuel back to $1.50 a liter. I can change, if we work extra hard, we work 260 days a year on average, the 240, I can change that, and the values update automatically. And, we envision that one common approach people might take is to rely on proxy data for some of the specific unit costs or parameters, things like, salaries or vehicle costs, or even, like travel speed assumptions, and then, enter in their own data, look up their own data to try to scale the supply chain to match their own country's size. So we might change the land area if you think that yours is bigger or smaller. If you have, 10 regional warehouses that you're looking at, you change the number of facilities. So things like the land area, number of facilities, we might expect would be relatively easy to obtain and would go a long ways towards, tailoring the data to match whatever supply chain you're actually trying to model here. So for now anyways, though, we will go ahead and stick with the baseline proxy data template, which means that we're essentially, at this point, our baseline model is recreating the costing study that underlies this data template. And so then we're done with the inputs worksheet now. It's time to move to the outputs worksheet. So this is an example here of what a blank outputs worksheet looks like. It has a lot of reference errors here because we haven't yet told it which inputs to use. So we go up to the very top to this green box up here to specify which worksheet we're going to use to supply inputs. And we only have one option here, so we'll select it. And then once we select that, then everything falls into place. And so in this outputs worksheet, we have, the first table gives a high-level summary of the supply chain, including an annual estimated operating cost. The next two tables deal with more efficiency-related metrics, including utilization of different transport resources for vehicles, and then utilization of different warehouses and storage capacities. And then as we move through tables 4 and 5, we start to get more detailed breakdowns of costs, both by level in the supply chain and by functional area. And then you can see on the right here, we have a few graphs that help visualize that data, in the case that they're useful. And so with that, we have one scenario completely built up, and now we need to create multiple scenarios. And so to do that, there are basically two steps. The first is to copy and rename the inputs and outputs worksheets. And then you need to add their names, those worksheet names, to the scenario manager. So in terms of copying and pasting, it's pretty straightforward. You literally just copy the worksheet and drop it in right next to the old one. And so with that, we've created a copy of this inputs worksheet, and you can go ahead and rename it. We'll call it 2 inputs. And then we go back to the scenario manager. We can change the number of scenarios to 2 now. Another box will open up, and we can type in that name into the worksheet. And now we've added that to our list of scenarios. So in the interest of time, I won't go through and add all these manually. We'll switch to another worksheet where they've all been completed. But that's basically the process you would go through here. And so now on this screen, you should see now a set of 4 inputs worksheets and a set of 4 outputs worksheets that each correspond with the 4 scenarios that I mentioned in the slide. So we have a name for those scenarios. We have a brief description of them that matches what was in the slides. And so now we should be good to go. So in each of the inputs worksheets, the first one matches the example that we just created, where I haven't changed anything except loading up this proxy data set. The second one is the same as the first one, except here that I've multiplied the demand level by 1.5, and then also multiplied the value of the inventory by 1.5 as well. So that's sort of the current state system with increased demand, and that's the only change that I've made to this scenario. For number 3, I've also included the high demand, but then we've made some additional changes here. We're increasing the number of shipments per year from 4 to 12 at each of the different facilities. And because we're processing more shipments, out of these warehouses, we probably also need to increase the number of staff who are working there, or at least the number of hours that they're working. And so then finally, since we're delivering more frequently, we also need to increase likely the number of vehicles that we're using, or at least the amount of time that they're dedicated to supply chain. And then finally, for the last scenario, we've also increased demand into the 1.5 level. And then this scenario, we've increased storage capacity also by 1.5, the previous level. And then, because we're actually processing a greater volume of product per order, now each order takes longer, so we also then probably need additional warehouse staff hours. And so those are all the changes that we made to the input sheet to create each of those 4 scenarios. So like we mentioned, it's a relatively small set of changes that can create, a relatively large impact across these different scenarios. And so then now that we've finished the inputs, for the outputs, the biggest thing here is just to check to make sure that we're pulling from the right input sheet. So we need 1 input to line up with 1 output, 2 inputs should line up with 2 outputs, and same thing with 3 and with 4. And in addition to verifying that, we should also then double check each of the individual output sheets to make sure that there's no, big error messages or anything that we indicate that we've, missed an input or input something incorrectly. And in this case, they all look pretty good. And so we should be able to go back to the overall scenario manager to compare these 4 scenarios against each other. And so now that we're back in the scenario manager and we have all 4 of these scenarios entered and loaded into the tool, now it's time to compare them, analyze it, and see what insights these can tell us. And so the first place that I would look would be at the utilization of different storage and transportation resources. So these rows here, 32 through 63. And we can see that the baseline model looks pretty good. It's actually between 60 and 80% for everything, which is pretty much right where you want a utilization number to be. And then scenarios 3 and 4 also, are at least below 100%. But scenario 2 is not actually looking very good. So the transportation is okay, but for both the storage capacity at a warehouse and the labor, the number of people working at the warehouse, we're well over 100% utilized, and actually almost 130% in these cases. And to give an illustration of what that means, basically means that 1 out of every 4 orders has no place to be stored or has no people available to pick it. So just 1 out of every 4 orders is not going to be filled. And so that basically means that this system isn't feasible, that the baseline model that we had originally can't handle the future levels of demand that we're projecting without some serious impact on its ability to deliver commodities effectively. So in order to handle that increased demand, we pretty much have to look at one of these 2 scenarios, scenario 3 or scenario 4. And so to dig further into those, let's kind of go back to this top level, annual operating cost line. And the first thing we can do is look at really either of these scenarios in comparison to the original baseline, because that will show us, in a sense, an estimate of how much this increase in demand will actually affect costs. And so we see that, each of these 2 scenarios is, $600,000 to $700,000 a year more expensive than the baseline. And so that's the broad estimate that you can report back to your boss when they ask, what's the impact of this demand increase on our supply chain costs? It's going to increase them by $600,000 to $700,000. Or if you want to be more conservative, knowing that we've had a few estimates in there, maybe you say, $500,000 to $1 million per year for delivery of products in this particular region. So we can also compare these 2 solutions against each other, and we see that scenario 3 is nominally, what is that, $120,000 or so more expensive than number 4, which is a significant amount, but it's also only, 5 to 6% of the total cost. So if there were other reasons to favor one system over the other, If, for example, one of them was much easier to implement than the other, then that might be more of a deciding factor than the cost difference between them. Furthermore, if we go back to these utilization numbers here, we can see that while, for storage capacity, scenario 4 is still pretty high in the 70s and 80s, but scenario 3 is actually really low. It's in the 40s, which means that we're actually using less than half the storage that we're paying for. And so if we can find some way to reduce that amount, either if we're renting the space to stop renting it, or if we own it, then maybe we can rent some of it out to somebody, then we can actually make this scenario a little more competitive. So to make that change, we can go back into the inputs for scenario 3. We go back up to storage capacity, and we can maybe reduce that from 900 cubic meters to, let's say, 500 at each the national and the regional levels. So that's assuming we're able to find some way to offload this excess capacity that we have. If we go back now, all of a sudden, these two models are basically dead even in terms of cost. So we've using this tool, we found a way to make this particular system more efficient. And then there's one final metric that would be good to look at here, and that is the value of the inventory in the system. So we're looking at the total dollar value of all of every individual product that's being held somewhere in the system at a given point in time. And the difference between these two models is almost $14 million, which is just in this one province of a particular country, which is a huge difference. So every dollar that's tied up in inventory is a dollar that you can't spend on a program goal. And furthermore, then having more inventory in the system means that you're less responsive to changes. So changes in demand or changes in new products that you're rolling out just take longer to actually push their way through the system. And then having more inventory ultimately means more opportunity for lost, pilfered, or expired product. And so that this is one of the reasons why average inventory levels is a key metric that a lot of private companies focus on in order to understand and improve their own efficiency. And so given that these two options, scenario 3 and scenario 4, are otherwise pretty similar to each other, this difference here is a big reason to lean towards option 3 if you feel like they would be similarly easy to implement. And so that's just kind of a taste for the types of analysis you can do once you load up these different scenarios. So, and just I guess to recap that really quick, we've basically in the course of the last 20 minutes here have set up this high-level analysis, and it's relatively short and high-level, obviously, but it's already given us some actionable insights here. First, just that it's likely that the current system won't be able to support the kind of demand that we're projecting, the demand increase we're projecting. So we're going to have to make some kind of change to the system. And we also then have a ballpark estimate for how much of a cost increase that change is likely to create, $600,000, $700,000 a year. And then finally, while the two solutions we explored are relatively similar in many ways, and they're both worth exploring in more depth, we at least have some sense that one option might be slightly favorable over the other because of because it requires less inventory to operate. And if it's equally feasible to implement, then it would leave our program in a much better financial situation. So I guess with this relatively low level of effort, we hopefully now have enough information to sort of kickstart action and chart a path forward in terms of how we're going to address this issue in more detail. And that's the ultimate goal of a tool like this. It's not necessarily to provide the definitive right answer, but really to catalyze action in the right direction as quickly as we can. And so that's really that's everything that we had to share with you today. In terms of next steps, the first release version of the tool is already available on VillageReach's website at the link that you can see in the slides here. So that's www.villagereach.org/resources. And we'll have the tool up on the WDI and probably the RHSC websites soon as well. And we'll also disseminate via email to all the RHSC working groups and to the IAPHL listserv once we made a couple of final formatting tweaks. And so with that, I guess we'd love to hear from the audience any questions or comments they may have. We're really excited to present this work to you today, and we would love to hear your thoughts on it. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike. We realized that actually we had planned this webinar for an hour and a half. So hopefully those with questions will be able to stay and we can continue the conversation. So I have received a few questions in here. Some of the technical folks weighed in early. So the first question was from Leila Aklagi. Is cost the only output? Is it possible to measure customer service levels, or in other words, demand met or in-stock measurements?
Yeah, no, I can take that question, and thanks, Leila. That is a great question, and it's one that we wrestle with a lot, as well. And I think the short answer is no. That cost is not the only thing that matters here. There's another side of this, which is for each of these different scenarios that we're analyzing, what is their impact on service levels and what is their impact on other types of performance. I think that the short answer is that those questions, those issues like service levels are actually kind of hard to model with any tools, because you're modeling how effectively someone's adhering to all of the SOPs, and you're modeling how effectively the funding mechanisms that are keeping supply chains operating are actually working. And I think that we certainly have tools that can kind of estimate based on demand variability or based on supply variability some sort of a statistical estimated service level, but I'm not sure that we at a really detailed level can model that, and certainly we can't with just this tool. And so I think the way that I would envision that playing out is that you use cost as kind of as maybe an entry point for getting into this discussion with some of the questions like that Dorothy mentioned, like what is the potential savings we could have here if we were to change the design, and you try to use this tool alongside some other analysis, whether it's modeling or qualitative, to indicate whether you think the service levels will improve or stay the same, or if there's a risk that they'll deteriorate. You're kind of using these two sets of inputs in conjunction with one another.
Good, thanks, Mike. The next question was about the scalability of the model. Can the model really be applied to any scenario? Are there any limits in terms of geographic coverage and so on?
Yeah, so I guess I would say theoretically, it can be scaled, down as small or as big as you would like. You basically, the tool itself is pretty generalized. It's got, up to 6 tiers, and I think up to, 3 different modes of transportation for 3 different types of travel at each tier. And so those are kind of the hard limits that you have on what can be entered into the model. And the other limits would be then, again, this assumption that every facility within a tier has an equivalent level of demand and is an equivalent distance away. And so I think within those boundaries, there's not really any limit. I guess I would say practically, it probably is best suited for, one country or maybe one region within a country, or even like a district, I guess, if you wanted to. But once you start getting, multiple countries in there, that you're increasing the likelihood that broad average across all facilities is actually kind of masking some important differences there, if that makes sense. So there's not a hard and fast rule, but it's kind of just, the broader you get and the more countries you throw in there, the greater the chance that your estimate differs significantly or is obscuring some kind of important detail.
Okay. And so the next question is from Benjamin Hatch. Can you please explain the total land area covered by facilities in each supply chain tier from the data template? I'm assuming a tier is a level of the system, such as regional, district, or facility level, and it's not clear why the land area covered would be different between tiers.
Oops, sorry, I was on mute there. Yeah, so I think it's referring to this particular data line there. Yes, it is referring to the total land area that the facilities you've specified here are actually distributed within. And the primary reason why it might change is actually if you're modeling, let's say, one province of a country, but you want to also then include the national central medical store, then you might use the whole country's land area for the first tier, and then the regional area for all of the downstream tiers. And that's actually what this example that we pull up actually uses that. And so the way in which that value gets incorporated is actually in calculating and estimating the average distance between a facility and its upstream supplier. So having a greater distance or a greater land area here will ultimately increase this distance estimate in order to reach the second level of the supplier.
Okay, and then I've got another question here. Is the tool already used by any of the stakeholders in one of the countries where VillageReach is working, specifically like a local central medical store or a Ministry of Health?
Dorothy, do you want to talk a little bit more about what VillageReach is working on there?
Yeah, and you can back me up if you would like as well, Mike. We're using the tool in 2 different locations right now. We're using it in the context of reproductive health supply chains in Kano State in Nigeria to look at maternal, neonatal, and child health commodities in Kano. And then we're also using the tool in Angola, primarily to do a validation exercise in the context of immunization supply chains, where we are going with kind of a more traditional supply chain costing analysis. And we're going to compare those outputs to this tool's outputs. And again, that's for immunization supply chains in Angola at the national level.
Great. And then this question was from John Skibiak, and he was wondering how limited is the tool if there is no region-specific proxy data? Is there sort of a set of universal proxy data, or this is really getting to the limitations of the data that's contained in the tool?
Sure, I can take a stab at that one. I think, well, first of all, it depends on the data point that you're talking about. I think for things like, vehicle prices, for example, at least in the data sets that we've gathered, which cover, Latin America and a couple of different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they might vary from let's say $45,000 to $55,000 for one Land Cruiser or something like that. So there's some variation, but not a huge range of variation there for some of those parameters. For other ones, I think you might expect more variability, particularly around let's say demand levels, which might depend on people's ability to access healthcare, or also the program areas that are covered, which would be a big factor there. And so I guess there's no, again, this is getting to there aren't really any hard and fast limits to what can be analyzed. And I think it's more a trade-off between, how valuable is having an answer versus how, what is the potential risk of bias or error there. We could all use this estimate that we just created on the data template for our own supply chains, but obviously, depending on which ones we are, it would be pretty far off. And so I guess it ultimately reflects a trade-off of your priorities. Then how much time are you willing to spend, tailoring it to your own system? And so it's a little bit hard then to nail a specific point beyond which the proxy data aren't valuable anymore, because it might end up being pretty valuable to have even an order of magnitude estimate, even if it's 20 or 30% off, just to get some sense of what level of funding we're dealing with, or what level of cost.
Great. And then this question is another one from Leila Aklagi. Does the model tell you how the various costs change within the total costs? For example, inventory holding costs may go up while transportation may go down, but the overall cost may not change. But in this case, say the customer service levels have increased.
Right. So I think, I mean, again, we can answer the first part of that question. Let's see if we go back over here. We can see, we can see on the graph kind of the breakdown between the different scenarios in terms of total cost and how that's split between different types of functions. And if we were to dig deeper into it, we could get individual breakdowns in terms of like vehicle depreciation across all of them, or labor costs or whatever. But again, we don't have the ability to model the other side of that, which is the service level change. And so that's something that you would have to do either qualitatively, just saying we think we can implement any of these models without really a change in service level, or we want to switch to, let's say, an informed push model or something like that, where we think we're going to see a big improvement in service level. And the question that we're trying to analyze with this tool is, what do we expect the change in cost to be? And is that change in cost worth what we, separately, independently expect to be the benefits of it? I don't know if does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. So the next question is from Richard Holmes. Did you think about time phasing in your model? For example, multiple years.
So, I mean, we certainly think about time savings in the sense of, like labor for storage and delivery ultimately, is based on a number of hours that people are spending working on those tasks. And the fewer hours they spend, the lower the cost is. I'm not sure I follow the example you gave of multiple years. I guess we're, going back to one thing I mentioned in the slides, we're sort of assuming this is kind of a steady state operating cost. And so we're not really looking at the cost of implementing it, or like the system as it's sort of transitioning from a current state to some future state. We're only really looking at what happens once that future state is up and running. And then the cost estimates that we're providing here are sort of essentially an annual operating cost estimate for that system once it's up and running. I'm not sure if that addressed the question though, so feel free to chat another one.
And then this one, do you assume straight line distances?
No, we don't. So we calculate straight line distances in order to scale the system to a certain land area and a certain number of facilities distributed within that land area. But then we multiply that straight line distance by what we call a circuity factor, which is basically a ratio of road distance to straight line distance, assuming that roads are windy and that to travel 100 linear kilometers might take 140 or 150 kilometers by road. And so that value, we actually have a couple of reference data sets there that we've put together, and we have values in each of our data templates. And you can also estimate that actually using Google Maps. If you're able to find the facilities that you're traveling between, on the maps themselves, you can use the Google Maps to estimate driving directions and then also measure the straight line distance right on the map itself, as an FYI.
Okay, cool. And can this tool be used to cost the logistics information system?
That is an excellent question. The short answer is partially. It can cost the system out to the extent that, I guess the portion of that LMIS system that involves actual physical travel, and it can cost out, in the sense of having certain assets in a warehouse that then drive up the kind of operating cost of that warehouse. But it is a little bit, it is more focused on the actual physical movement of the products than the infrastructure set up to manage information flows. So there's kind of a limited ability to capture that.
Mm. Okay, and we have a follow-up here. The use of the tool by VillageReach is one thing, but I would like to know whether the tool is strong and convincing enough for locally based stakeholders to use it. There have been many tools by international NGOs or multilateral organizations, but there have been very few that have been adopted by the Ministry of Health or CMS, who I think we would like to target for this tool. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll give a couple quick thoughts, and then maybe Dorothy can come in with some VillageReach's experience. I mean, from our perspective, we've been spending most of the last year actually developing the tool and trying to get it to a point where we would feel comfortable releasing it to the general public. And so we actually haven't had a ton of opportunity to spend trying to actually get this, more widely used. And so that's the next step here. I will say from our perspective, by making it something that's designed in Excel and doesn't really involve any macros or anything, it's a calculator that you can use to, input the information you have and get out, a certain set of estimates. We've tried to, design it as much as possible to be something that's easy for a local level stakeholder to download and pick up and run with and adapt to their own purposes. But we're just now kind of getting on that track of actually being able to, to test it and use it in more depth in places like Kano and Angola and potentially, a couple more countries in Latin America once we follow up there. So we're just now getting to that point.
Yeah, and I think I echo what Mike is saying as well, in the sense that, as we talked about in the presentation about our experiences conducting our validation exercise using, kind of historical data or data that had been procured from costing studies that, WDI did not do, VillageReach did not do, and in those instances we're a bit removed from the data. And so I think that as we are continuing to solicit proxy data from different partners and people who are learning about the tool, and as we can move forward with, as I'd indicated, the work we're doing in Angola, where we are closer to that data and can have a bit stronger of a connection with the group who's doing the kind of more traditional costing study. I think that as we continue doing that, as we continue to socialize the tools, that supports us in having greater confidence in it to start, forging more of those contacts with local folks.
Okay, so this question is, how long does it take to go through, apply the tool, and come out with these types of scenarios? Could you give us an estimate of the time it took when you had some data and how long it took when you had to go through sort of a data collection process? And the other question is this tool interoperable, with other tools such as DHIS tool and IHRIS? It's a lot of acronyms there.
Yeah, so I think in terms of a time estimate, I mean, the demo that I showed on the webinar today is maybe at the fast extreme of that. If you have data that's already kind of loaded up, or you're willing to run with an existing proxy data set, then obviously you can create all of those analyses and the scenarios pretty quickly in the scale of a half an hour or an hour. I spent a little bit of time in the background there, probably about half an hour's worth, trying to just tweak some of those numbers to make sure that the end results came out the way that they did. But that would be a pretty quick example. And if we were to spend another half an hour, we could probably tailor this proxy data set to another similar country in terms of land area, number of facilities, maybe scaling demand as well based on a change in program areas. So there's a few things we could add to this within, the span of a half an hour that would make it much more targeted to a specific country. But then, as you start getting more detailed there, a lot of that's going to depend on how accessible your specific data actually is. And if not, then, how much you're willing to pull from proxy data. So for example, I think in the Angola example that Dorothy mentioned, we probably spent about a week or so maybe, total across a couple of people, just combing through the data sets that we had available for Angola, pulling out the things that were useful to us, and then trying to figure out, what the best estimate was for the data that wasn't in place, that we didn't have access to. And that included, follow-up time with some folks, who are based in Angola or nearby. And so I guess maybe that might be a little bit more realistic of a time frame for something where you want to make sure that you have as much data as possible that are specific to that particular country. And let's see, I guess for the other question in terms of interoperability, this is just an Excel sheet with a couple of worksheets there for inputs and outputs. And so, I think we would envision something like the DHIS being something where you could take an output of that and plug it into the input sheet here, but there's not like a direct, automated link where you can, click something here and import a DHIS data set and it will automatically figure out what's what. Like that interim step is something that you would have to know how to find and input directly.
It also sounds like the more time you put into it, maybe the better quality or estimate you're going to get out of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Obviously, the flexibility of this tool is that it can go from something as simple as a half an hour analysis to something as detailed as a full, a fully fledged costing study. Obviously, the more and more detailed you get, the less and less comparative advantage this tool has over some of the more detailed costing and modeling tools that are out there. So that's kind of the spectrum you can operate on. But I think the main goal of this tool was to open up that rapid side of the spectrum, where if you need an estimate that's quick and dirty, that you now have the ability to quickly do that using this worksheet as sort of a calculator of sorts.
Got a question here. What does the tool cost for potential users?
Well, if you have Microsoft Office already on your computer, it is absolutely free. So there's it's just an Excel sheet, so there's no cost to use it. Great.
All right, looking at more questions. Does the system provide for making a difference between supply chain components being operated by either for-profit or not-for-profit providers?
That's a great question, and the short answer is no, it doesn't. It basically, it takes a set of inputs in terms of demand and facilities and geography, and estimates the amount of activity that needs to occur in terms of storage and distribution to make that whole system work, and then costs that out based on whatever unit costs are in there. And so that it's not inherently differentiating between a private company and a government entity or something like that. But you can also you could use this tool to sort of validate a bid that you're getting from a private company. So, for example, you are a government logistics manager and you're looking at outsourcing to private companies, and you get back bids for whatever it is, $5 million or whatever for the supply chain we showed in the demo. Then you can sort of estimate what their underlying cost structure is, so that you have some idea of how much they're likely charging for a profit margin. And that can be a piece of information that you go back to them with as a negotiating tool.
Great. That's another great use of the tool. So how do you see this tool working in an environment where there are other products flowing through the same supply chain system?
Meaning that they're each flowing through sort of like different pathways through the same set of locations. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I guess that so like non-reproductive health products are using the same, a more programmatic, an integrated programmatic supply chain. So you might have, I don't know, HIV products also in the same system as the reproductive health products.
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is that the tool itself doesn't really care which program area the commodities are attached to. They care how much space does the truck have, how much space does the warehouse have, how much space do the products take up, and are they cold chain products or are they ambient temperature, or are they just normal products? And so, as long as those commodities that you mentioned are sort of taking the same path through the system, so they're being transported on the same trucks, they're being stored in the same locations, they're being resupplied at the same frequency, then you can just include them all in the same, in the same model. Now, if let's say that you want to try to kind of piece together an integrated look at your supply chain, but you have different program areas, each sort of following different tracks, then you could actually use this scenario feature to sort of model each vertical as its own scenario, and then sort of aggregate, just add together the costs to get your overall system cost. So that would be one other way to represent, a whole system that actually is composed of individual parts that differ from each other a little bit, just as a general approach.
Great. And then how do the fixed and variable cost elements work? For example, fixed overheads versus variable costs with volume.
So the model, the tool represents the fixed costs as an annual depreciation rate. So, if you have a vehicle and its useful life is 7 years or whatever, then, it's estimating, it's attributing, whatever the purchase price of the vehicle is divided by 7 years as sort of the annual cost of purchasing that vehicle. And that's, at some levels, that's an accounting, function, not an actual cash outlay. But if you figure that you have, 20 vehicles in the fleet, you're probably going to replace them kind of on an ongoing basis. They're not all going to give out at the same time. And so it becomes a useful sort of real life approximation of that as well. And the same would be true for warehouse costs as well. So, you pay for the cost of the actual building itself, and, that building has a certain sort of expected useful life. And then as a separate line item, then you have the cost of actually running it. So we basically use depreciation as a way to capture the annual cost of the fixed costs of that aspect. And so I guess the other aspect there is that oftentimes, the fixed costs might change. They might also scale depending on size as well. So like a small warehouse might be more expensive on a per unit capacity basis than a big warehouse. And so to cover that, we really rely on the proxy data and having kind of a breadth of different sizes and different, like quality levels of warehouse costs, so that you can get a sense of what the range is there and be able to find a point within that's appropriate.
Great. So that was our last question. And so I think I'm turning it over to Charlotte to wrap up.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you all for this very interesting presentation. If there are other questions, we'll be able to send them to Michael and Dorothy, and they can answer later. Also, just to tell you that the video recording and the PowerPoint will be online on RHSC website, hopefully already tomorrow. And that's all for me. So just to thank you all for joining this webinar and having very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.